Good afternoon, and welcome to the 6th meeting of CSRIC VII, which I now open. Today we'll be receiving presentations on 3 reports. The first report is on standard operating procedures for emergency alerting communications. That will be presented by Mark Annis, who is standing in for the chair of Working Group 1, Craig Fugate. The second report we'll hear is on risks introduced by 3GPP releases 15 and 16 5G standards. We will hear from Farouk Khatibi. And then the third report is on security risks and best practices for mitigation in 911 in legacy transitional and next generation 911 implementation. Giving that presentation will be Mary Boyd, the chair of Working Group 4. And then we will hear progress reports from Kathy Whitbeck, who is the new chair of Working Group 2, and Dana McPherson, who is the chair of Working Group 6. Charlotte?
Yes, thank you very much, Suzanne. First of all, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll identify who's participating on the participant bridge. So I would like to just open it up saying, again, thank you for your time. And I'd also like to thank Lee Thibodeau, who, was the chair for WG2, Working Group 2, and has now transitioned that to Kathy Whitbeck, who is continuing the chair activities. So we thank Lee for all of his hard work over the last year and a half and wish him well in future adventures. And with that, I'm going to move directly to Mark Annis and the report on standard operating procedures for emergency alerting communications.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'll go ahead and get started. If we can go to the next slide. So first off, a little bit of a background. This is Working Group 1. We were tasked with, next slide, one more to the background. We were directed to recommend model emergency alerting communications SOPs that emphasize engagement with all entities and contribute to the dissemination of fast and reliable emergency information to the public. With that, we were, next slide. With that, we were tasked with certain objectives, including examination with respect to the following. We had 4 tasks. 1, establishing and maintaining communications between industry stakeholders, broadcasters, cable providers, government partners, and alert originators. Task 1 ensures an always ready state of communication among essential resources. It focuses on improving communication strategies among the key industry stakeholders, government partners, and alert originators. It also looks to ensure documentation, knowledge of key contacts, backup contacts, and the procedures to exchange information. Task 2 was developing and maintaining relationships between communication providers and alert originators that can readily be leveraged during emergencies. This task seeks to enhance the stability and strength of this communication structure by ensuring up-to-date knowledge of responsible parties, as well as building relationships among the leadership of stakeholders to create mutual trust and improve responsiveness through knowledge of each other's capabilities and response styles. Task 3 was establishing redundant and effective lines of communications with key stakeholders during emergencies, including Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, or GET, and the Wireless Priority Service, WPS. Task 3 addresses the alternate communication strategies that should be the original intended system or strategies unexpectedly that could fail in real time, or in the case of extreme circumstances, when use of all possible avenues to speed alert dissemination is critical for public safety. Stakeholders should have both a communication and technological connection strategy to enable consistent messaging and coordination if your primary method is interrupted. And it's imperative that personnel be prepared to recognize the need to include additional communication tools such as GETS or WPS into the process, and to be able to smoothly implement a switchover to or integration of those additional communication channels. Task 4 was the important elements that should be included in an alert message that retract or correct false alerts. This targets a specific scenario of a false alert and was included based on recent real-life events. The FCC wrote this task to ensure the establishment of clear, efficient recovery procedures to retract or correct information already disseminated by a false alert. Due to the negative impacts to the public that will occur no matter how efficient the recovery process, we expanded this task to also address recommended practices for the prevention of false alerts. Next slide. So our final report was due to today in our September meeting. And I know we also were tasked with another task that we're going to be bringing forward at a meeting in the near future. But as far as those 4 tasks, we are on schedule and we're presenting it today. Next slide. We had quite a few working group members from across industries and government, alert originators, the Weather Service, emergency management, the telecommunications system, radio, as well as television and cable. And we are very appreciative for the work that they have been able to contribute to this report. We also had a few alternates on our next slide. These were alternates to our primary members, but they also were very helpful in our report writing and editing. Next slide. So the conclusions from this are various recommendations and next steps are included in this report, which will continue to improve the current alert system by assisting all personnel in their tasks, supporting their ability to reach out, and work as part of a greater team and share knowledge. The false alert handling recommendations will decrease stress in both the alert personnel and public by reducing the number of false alerts and bringing a more automated structure to the reactions following a false alert. There were 8 FCC action items that are indicated throughout the sections contained in this report and the recommendations. Specifically placed in the sections, they carry out related recommendations. These action items may apply to both the FCC and to industry. And I just wanted to go ahead and read out the 8 action items as they pertain to this report. Task 1 and Task 2 action items. So action item 1, the analysis is needed to determine the information already collected and accessible to begin building a database, as well as to determine the gap between this data and the complete set of data as required, as described in the detail above, obviously in the detail above of the recommendations. This responsibility could be a first step for the database administrator. Note, this data falls into 2 categories of essential and desirable. The essential data addresses Task 1 as assigned to CSRIC 7. Desirable data represents additional data that complements the Task 2 recommendations by facilitating widespread knowledge of the capabilities of other stakeholders and their facilities, thereby enabling better sharing of technical and process knowledge, common practices, and a sense of community. Action 2 was Eyes on iPods. Is an example of connecting stakeholders to iPods alerts. We can just stay on the conclusion slide for now. So action item 2 was a concerted effort to analyze the possibilities for expanding the Eyes on iPods or developing similar information sharing tools to serve the entire emergency alert ecosystem as recommended. Stakeholders should be educated on the availability of the data and the potential uses. Action item 3 was to encourage stakeholder software updates that support real-time awareness of error conditions by the alert originators. Error conditions received in the response from a downstream stakeholder should be relayed back to the originating party. Action item 4 was to consider what would be required to create an independent central database of alert originator and industry stakeholder contact information, including identifying costs, determining the best approach to administration, which is including providing oversight to ensure consistency and security, and determining the appropriate administrator. Task 3 did not have any related action items, but Task 4 had 4 additional action items. So action item 5 was to review sections and recommend for incorporation into the alert originator standard operating procedures. Item 6 was to recommend that we recommended that the FCC consider a rulemaking to require the inclusion of text in test alerts to indicate that a test is being conducted. Action item 7 was any personnel with access to both WIA and EAS for sending alerts should be required to have training It clearly explains key differences between the two systems and the difference in alert handling that will result from each of these key actions. And following the last action item was the ability to describe the above to allow the alert originator to initiate a near instant update in a manner that both stops the broadcast of the false WIA, or wireless emergency alert, and reaches the mobile devices with a message indicating that the alert was canceled is in use, but not widespread use. It is recommended that vendors for alert originators be strongly encouraged to have similar functionality available. Next slide. So those were the 8 action items from the report, and it also the report also had best practices, recommended practices, and various recommendations to industries. The members of Working Group 1 respectfully request that CSRIC 7 Council adopt the report on standard operating procedures for emergency alerting communications.
Thank you, Mark. Let's see, let's open it to the membership for any comments or questions.
Q. Steve Watkins.
Hi, Steve. You have the floor.
Afternoon. Thank you. Yeah, I'd request that the chair be given editorial privileges, including for the following. All the capitalized words, terms, or terms of art and associated derivations be defined prior to or at the first use in the sections to which the capitalized terms are applicable or globally as appropriate. Similarly, the words or terms that are intended to specifically reference defined words or terms be capitalized accordingly, again, assuring that they're defined before the first use or prior. Otherwise, remove the capitalization as appropriate of defined terms which are not intended to be defined, but rather common usage or otherwise. With that being said, let me kind of give you an example. There's a section 3.2.2 on wireless emergency alerts where 3 terms are defined: capital alert, capital update, capital cancel. However, those 3 terms are subsequently used in section 7.3 being applied to EAS, but they've only been defined within the section on wireless emergency alerts. So they're not in context when they're used for EAS. It needs to, again, be more globally defined as appropriate. Similarly, there's kind of a common thread or theme as it relates to, let's just call it alert. The difference between alert, capital alert, new capital alert, and capital new capital alert. I know it's a mouthful. But in section 3.2.2, they define capital alert, but again, these 4 variations of alert throughout the document make it confusing. One example is to say capital new capital alert would tend to imply, well, that first of all, new capital alert is not defined. Other cases where it uses the term new capital alert, that is redundant because alert is already defined as being a new alert, or capital alert is being defined as a new alert. So new capital alert effectively reads new alert. So it's that kind of confusion that I think we'd like to get corrected. Again, the purpose of this is not to slow down the process at all, but to remove the ambiguity and provide clarity so that those that make use of this document as a reference or a starting point for additional work product have a document that is clear and concise. So in summary, I recommend the report be adopted by CSRIC 7 with non-substantive editorial privileges reserved for Craig Fugate.
Thank you, Steve. Any other comments or concerns or disagreement with what Steve just said? So I believe we're ready to take a vote with the edification that Steve made that editorial privileges be made to clear up any confusion about the definition of terms within the document. And so with that, let's take a vote. All those that say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Okay, so Working Group 1, report on standard operating procedures for emergency alert communications, has been approved by CSRIC with those editorial privileges that we discussed and those modifications to be made to make it clearer. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Farouk Katabi who will be talking about the report on risks introduced by 3GPP releases 15 and 16 5G standards. Farouk?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Next slide, please. So as Madam Chair mentioned, this is the report of Working Group 3 on managing risk in emerging 5G implementations. Next slide, please. So in the way of background, the working group description, we talk about Release 16, which is a set of standards of address core aspects of 5G, which was finalized in 2020. But there is still discussion ongoing on the potential risk introduced in 5G network, and that's the purpose of the discussion in Working Group 3. Next slide, please. We are given two objectives. The first objective is to evaluate Release 15 and 16 standards of 3GPP and identify any risk areas and develop a risk mitigation strategy. And the second objective is to consider all the optionalities that are in 3GPP specifications and discuss what would be the best approach for North America deployment. And I think Kathy will mention there are multiple reasons why we have these optionalities in 3GPP, because 3GPP is a multinational organization, but there is discussion ongoing in Working Group 2 and 3 on what are the best options to make them interoperable as well as secure in North America. Next slide, please. So we have two reports. The first report that we are going to discuss today is on network reliability and security risk reduction. And this is with respect to Release 15 and 16. Next slide, please. And the other report is on the optional features of 3GPP standards that can diminish the effectiveness of 5G security. Next slide, please. In the way of schedule, first report is completed. That's what we will present today. And the second report, we have already started. We have had a very good discussion on it over at least over a month since the last CSRIC, so it's several months, and that work is ongoing. Next slide, please. This is a list of our Working Group 3 members. As I always say, without the help, support, and participation and contribution of these members, work could not progress. So we certainly appreciate their participation and contribution. Next slide. And we also have a number of alternates, and often many of these alternates are very active and contributing to the work. So we certainly appreciate their participation and contribution on the work. Next slide, please. So just one slide on the 5G background. I think everyone knows about most aspects of 5G, but 5G wireless and network technology is enabling a new wave of innovations and, making life better. There are multiple aspects to 5G. There's a 5G new radio, NR, which is the air interface aspects, the global standard for unified, more capable 5G wireless air interface. That obviously provides significant, is faster, less latency and all the good stuff that ITU made a recommendation on those. There's also a 5G core network part, which has defined that allows many different functions to be built, configured, connected, and deployed with a scale, required scale. And this is an important, we often talk about 5G NR, but there are so many innovations done at the 5G core net for 5GC that it's definitely worth mentioning. And one aspect of it that I mentioned here is a service-based architecture, SBA, which is basically says that registering the devices services and devices can register themselves and subscribe to other services. And next slide, please. There's a pictorial that we have that shows how we went from 4G on the top 4G core network to 5G service-based architecture. And as you can see, this is familiar with you. I mean, you all have, Ethernet connection, whether it's wireless or wireline, or at work you have the wireline connection. And what happens is that all the devices sit on the same bus and they can exchange, communicate, instead of going point to point. They sit on the same bus, and that enables, scaling as well as flexibility and so forth. So this is the architecture that 5G core has enabled us right now. Next slide, please. So with respect to the scope of Working Group 3, often Working Group 2 goes before me, so I don't have to explain this too much. But today I have the privilege of spending maybe 15 more seconds describing this thing. But in general, early on in 3GPP, we discussed how we will deploy the 5G network, and there were two options. The left side, which is what we call the option 3, is called non-standalone option, where we use the 4G network to provide the control plane, but the user plane, all the data goes through the new radio. Then in the longer term, we obviously would like to have a standalone architecture, and the standalone architecture would have the 5G core network and the new radio together. So that's the second picture with that is being shown. And the main focus of Working Group 3 is on the standalone architecture versus Working Group 2 is focusing on the non-standalone architecture. And in addition to the option 2, we are also looking at any variation of 5G core network, including option 7 and option 4. So in general, the focus of Working Group 3 is on option 2 and any related 5G core network option. Next slide, please. The methodology that we used, basically we gathered, SMEs to make presentation towards. We looked at activities in standard bodies, 3GPP, IETF, GSMA, etc. We asked individual contributors from various companies to come and make presentation to us. We reviewed academic papers. So we basically put everything on the table to understand what are the potential security risks. And with respect to that, we also considered NIST SP 800-39 methodology. There's a picture there shown. So that's the methodology we use to do the analysis and find the mitigation techniques and make some recommendations. Next slide, please. So I will go through the next few slides on the recommendations we made. There are two sets of recommendations. The first set are recommendations that we made to FCC, and the next set is to recommendations we made to the industry. The first recommendation we made to the FCC is that the working group recommends that FCC effort to support CSRIC recommendation on the previous one, and as shown by previous public notices. Working Group 3 recommends that the FCC encourage industry for continued implementation of CSRIC's prior recommendation and continue to promote awareness. So a lot of great work was done in CSRIC 6, CSRIC 5, others. So we would continue. We would like to make sure that those great work will be continued to be supported. Next slide, please. Then, with respect to supply chain recommendation, CSRIC 6 Working Group 3 published an amendment to their final report regarding supply chain recommendation. Furthermore, there are a number of activities going on right now with respect to supply chain. There's ICT, supply chain risk management task force. There's NIST going on, and there is a lot of effort going on in ATIS 5G supply chain working group. So we would like the working group would like to make sure that these activities supply chain continue to be monitored and supported. Next slide, please. There is this concept of network slicing, and this maybe not everyone is familiar what network slicing means. I put a little definition. Network slicing is nothing more than a logical network. It's not a physical, but a logical network that provides specific network capabilities and characteristics. So it is really defined within a carrier's PLMN, public land mobile network, and includes control plane, user plane, as well as access network. So if you think about it, we have a physical network, but you can create a new slice based on a logical characteristic that you want. And we will go through some specific recommendations to the industry with respect to network slicing, but we believe this is a very important topic, and 3GPP is working on it as we speak, and other groups are working on it as we speak. So this is an important and interesting topic. So the working group recommends that FCC consider further investigating the security application of network slicing for future CSRIC tasks. So this would be something that we would recommend, that network slicing, and we will go through some specific recommendation, but we would recommend that FCC perhaps would wish to do a little bit more focus on future CSRIC with respect to network slicing. Next slide, please. There is another very important and interesting concept that being discussed, and this is we're being discussing as we speak in 3GPP, and that's 5G private network, or as we call it in 3GPP NPN, or non-public network. And the definition of private network or a non-public network is intended for sole purpose of private entities such as an enterprise or factory floor. You know, we have industrial automation, etc. They may wish to have their own network configured and utilize both virtual and physical elements. So they want to have their own network. But they may also be able to deploy that either in a completely standalone network, as well as hosted by a carrier, by a PLMN, or being a slice of a carrier's PLMN. So this whole concept of private network is another really interesting and hotly discussed subject in 3GPP. So we have a brief discussion on private network in section 5.4 of our report, but since this is very new in 3GPP, it's not new, but it's being actively discussed as we speak. The working group recommends that FCC consider further investigation into 5G private network security in future CSRIC tasks. Next slide, please. And finally, not finally, but in the 5G support of different access technology, this is something that we discussed. What would happen, for example, if we have fiber optics, satellite, wireline, all different wireline, those access technologies. So we really didn't dive too much into this particular subject. There are discussions going on in 3GPP right now with different access technologies, support of 5GC for different access technologies, and there are some actually ideas about it. But this is another subject that we believe in the longer term may be of interest for making sure that security aspects of different access technologies, wireline, satellite, etc., and other access wireless technology, Wi-Fi 6, so forth, and their connection to 5G core network are well supported and understood. Next slide, please. Now we go through a number of recommendations that we have to industry. The first recommendation to industry is please make sure that you follow recommendations from previous CSRICs. So CSRIC 4, 5, 6, they have done some great recommendations, and we would support those recommendations. So the first recommendation is to for the industry to please follow those mitigation techniques. Next slide, please. And the next one is protection of legacy protocol. And this is a kind of like important one, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper into it. So the protection of legacy protocol, diameter, GTP, and so forth, and associated support according to network domain security IP, NDS IP, is defined in 3GPP 33.210. But in case of intermediate, like you have hop by hop situation, it doesn't ensure end-to-end message authenticity and confidentiality protection. So additional protection of diameter interface was discussed in CSRIC 6, Working Group 3, and there are some recommendations, and those recommendations, again, it's very important to make sure that the industry follow those recommendations. Next slide, please. And in this slide, we actually have a pictorial presentation of what we are talking about it, because this is an important enough subject that CSRIC 6 spent quite a bit of time on it, and we believe that this is going to continue to be important in 5G as well, since we have this transition from 4G to 5G. We have these security concerns using legacy protocol. For example, unified data management (UDM) may be prone to known HLR, HSS specific attacks that exist on legacy 3G, 4G inter-carrier SS7 and diameter roaming links. Also, things like SMS function and charging function, they're prone to known, SMS function has this MSC, VLR specific SS7 or diameter attacks that exist on inter-carrier SS7. With respect to charging function, is also it can be exploited voluntarily, vulnerability that exists in base diameter protocol implementation without transport layer protection. And some of these we actually have a little bit more discussion even on our second report, but we have done quite a bit of discussion on these topics in our first report. Finally, the session management function and user plane function may be prone to attack that may be explored by GPRS tunnel protocol, GTP, and packet forwarding protocol that are generally deployed without any message authentication, integrity, and confidential protocol. So as I said, there was quite a bit of discussion in the previous districts on this, and we had additional discussion on this, and this is a very important topic. That's why we wish to highlight it again. Next slide, please. So our recommendations are, so with respect to UDM, Unified Data Management, and SMSF, as we said, it's maybe prone to attack similar to what was done in earlier generation of HLR, HSS. And the same is true with respect to the working group. So basically, the working group recommends that remediation against known SS7 diameter attacks be implemented at interworking function, that safeguards for UDM be implemented, and the same is true with respect to SMS function. So there are some recommendations made that we believe that it's very important for industry to follow those remediation techniques. Next slide, please. Now, a little bit on the non-technical aspects with respect to workforce, there are a number of best practices being developed. So the working group recommends that industry leverages CSRIC collection of best practices to ensure that workforce is prepared to operate and maintain carrier-grade reliability and security in 5G standalone environment. This includes workforce training on network elements introduced in the 5G SA architecture, such as virtualization network. So we are coming up with new aspects like virtualization, network slicing, and so forth. They are not new, but 5G really embodied them. So we want to make sure that workforce training is implemented to understand exactly what those mean and make sure that security holes do not get patched immediately and we don't, they don't evolve. So there are some best practices that we need to follow on that. Next slide, please. Now, this is another interesting subject that we discussed quite a bit with respect to open source in 5G. There's a little bit of misconception that open source architecture means that there's going to be introduced security risk. That is not the case. In fact, open source, it's really defined in technical specification and provide a foundation architecture for improving security. As a matter of fact, this Monday, 2 days ago, there was a great FCC symposium, I don't know what you call it, webinar on open source aspects of RAN and others. So open source in general helps the ecosystem for provide new supply, increasing diversity of virtualization solutions, and inherently increase the security of network versus a proprietary single vendor network. So that open source has some strong good element towards 5G. So the working group recommends that industry continue to advance open architecture for 5G and continue to address security as fundamental consideration for all open source architecture. So this open source it's important, it's critical, and we want to make sure that it's done in a secure way. As a matter of fact, we were discussing about supply chain risk management. One of the topics that we were discussing in ATI's supply chain risk management group on how to ensure the open source elements are tracked and understood and secure. So there are multiple aspects to this open source, but overall, this open source activity is important to the industry, and we want to make sure that it's done in a secure way. Next slide, please. So I mentioned about the network slicing, and I want to be cautious about time. I have 5 slides on specifically about network slicing. I'm not going to go through them in detail. There's a lot more detail about these things in the report, but I'll just highlight some of the aspects. For example, the first one with respect to isolation. Isolation is crucial aspects of network slicing, making sure that resources dedicated to one slice it doesn't consume another slice. So these are the discussions that are happening through GPP, and we want to make sure that in the future we will have a good discussion on this thing, even on CSRIC, and make sure that they are done securely. The other one is slice isolation needs to be achieved assuming sound implementation of the cloud SDN transport and non-virtualization equipment. Next slide, please. As I said, I'm going a little bit at the high level. I just don't want to go too far detailed with respect to our presentation right now. Next slide, please. Thank you. Then another recommendation is with respect to slicing specific procedures such as slice selection, slice-specific authentication, authorization, so forth. So there is a really good discussion to be had on that. There's some aspects of it already in 33501, but that is still evolving. There's a plenary happening through GPP right now, and this is one of the hot topics there. Next slide, please. And also per slice network security measure. So slice is a virtual network, so general network security must be applied per slice. So even though a slice is a virtual part of a general network, but whatever we apply to the general network obviously needs to apply to each slice. For example, legacy measures apply to a virtualization network. Integrity protection, modern state-of-the-art pervasive monitoring. So all those AI, ML-based analytics that we are applying to the larger scale, they should also apply to the network slice. Next slide, please. Automated slicing security management and orchestration tools. We believe this is very important for industry to consider. Assurance level, network function may have diverse security assurance levels. So all network functions used in a slice must meet the assurance level required for the service deployed in their slice. So these are, it may seem obvious, but these are really important considerations when considering network slice. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I would like to, before Madam Chair, I will give you the floor for recommendation. What I would like to do is I would like to first thank Working Group 3 for their hard work, and I really mean their hard work. I mean, they've often been working on the weekends. There's tons of emails going back and forth. So even though we have calls, but there are a lot of conversation and discussion on email and private calls going on to progress this work. But the other part that is a personal one for me, and we have Mr. Lee Thibodeau on the call today, I would personally like to wish the working group to Chair Emeritus, that is retiring. I would like to wish him a happy and healthy day in his retired years. But if Madam Chair, if you allow me to go a little bit off script for a few seconds, when we started CSRIC 7, we had Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 that had some overlap in our agenda, in our objectives.
Mm-hmm.
What happened is that Lee called me. We had a great conversation, and he managed that so that we have a very clear delineation between our Working Group 2 and 3. And he continued to do an amazing job following up on that. And I got to tell you, this is a big shoes for Kathy and I to fill. So, Lee, I truly, honestly, thank you for all the work you have done with respect to not only Working Group 2, but with respect to Working Group 3 and interaction between us. You made our interaction pleasurable. So I really wish you a great retirement and happy days, and hope your golf game, I hope your handicap goes down and your golf handicap goes down, and you spend lots of time with your grandchildren. I don't know, Madam Chair, I don't know if this is acceptable or not. I don't know if we can allow Lee to make any comments, or we can maybe do it at the end of the call, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Baroque and Lee, why don't we make that towards the end of the call? Appreciate your comments about your working group, and also Lee's involvement in supporting Working Group 2 and 3. So with that, let me open it up to questions on Working Group 3. Okay, with not hearing any questions, I'm going to take a vote on accepting the recommendations, adopting the report on the risks associated with 3GPP Release 15 and 16 5G standards. May I have a vote of aye, please?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
I had to vote on something. Were you looking for a comment from me?
Is there a nay? Any nays associated with Working Group 3? Okay, thank you, Farouk, for presenting, and it has been accepted by the group. I'm going to circle back before we go to the final report, if I could, the final representation. And I just want to validate if some people made it on the telephone line but did not make it on the WebEx. So I know Craig Fugat was not going to make it, but Antoine Johnson, are you on the line? Chandra Katura? Jeff Littlejohn? Richard Piloto? Pat Roberts? Travis Russell?
Yep, I'm here.
Thanks, Travis. I thought you were here. And then John Williamson. Okay, and I've caught everybody else that's on the WebEx as in being present. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Boyd, who's going to report on the security risks and best practices for mitigation in 911 legacy, transitional, and next-gen 911 implementations. With that, Mary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Council. I'm going to share this presentation this afternoon with one of our CSRIC colleagues and work group member, Tim Lorello from Secular. Tim, are you on with me?
I sure am, Mary.
Oh, thank goodness. You've just kept me from passing out. Next slide, please. As y'all know, and the chair indicated, this work group is focused on the transition from legacy 911 networks into a full IP next generation 911 environment. And in that environment, systems can become at a higher risk from a cybersecurity standpoint. So the focus really of our work group and our report today is on the cyber aspects as we migrate. Next slide, please. The objectives of our working group are actually three. The first one we've completed, that was the identifying the current state of interoperability throughout our country with 911 systems. The Commission also directed us to identify the security risk in the 911 networks and the transition and recommend best practices to mitigate these risks. And then finally, to look at the vulnerabilities and those risks on a scale, and also look at the remediation expense to manage it. Next slide, please. This slide represents our first report. As you can see, that was completed. We finalized that in March on the interoperability status, and that report is published for the public today. Next slide. As part of our objectives and our deliverables for our current report that you'll hear today, we did look at historical outage information that was caused with security risks. Those were under discussion. Certainly, Mr. Lorello with his company has tons of expertise, and I'm honored that he is a part of our group. We looked and studied the risk on those transitions. We were to look at how we would protect the data as it transversed, evaluate best practices that exist today, which was completed during this report, and then develop new ones to minimize risks that may not have been available today on all the various networks, and then look at any barriers to implementation of our security recommendations. Next slide, please. Our final report, which is due next year, is the aspects of really looking at the cost to do this, looking at the vulnerabilities, those security risks, and then we will publish our report on the risk magnitude and the remediation. Next slide, please. This slide just summarizes our dates. If we are in good standing with Council, we'll get Report 2 finalized and adopted. And then in March, we will bring you Report 3. Next slide. This identifies all of our working group members. As I've said in prior meetings, I am honored to be able to work with this team of 911 experts. You are looking at a list of the A team when it comes to 911 matters in our country. Also, next slide identifies our alternates. I'm going to draw out just one gentleman, which I'm sure I always embarrass him. Tom Breen has been with us from the very beginning. He is actually our project manager, program manager to pull these reports together. He was with Comtech and recently went with Tim's company. He is now in an alternate role, but he does, Madam Chair, he does maintain the active role of being the project manager for this. And I can just say personally, I don't know. Well, I do know for a few days what it was like not to have Tom with us, and the work group was at risk when I had to run things and work on a document. So, Tom, bless you, and thank you for being back. Next slide. As I indicated, this report is on the cyber aspect and the risk as we transition into next generation 911. Next slide, please. The structure of our report is very standard for the Commission, in which they ask us to develop. It has, your executive summaries. We do provide an introduction in this report. You're going to hear about the threats and the protection and how to mitigate 6 use cases that sub-team worked on and was led by Mr. Lorello. We do draw our conclusions and recommendations for going forward. Next slide. Our methodology, you've heard us speak in the past, the task force on optimal PSAP architecture, TFOPA, that the Commission convened that task force back in 2016 2015. Working Group 1, it was led by one of our CSRIC council members, Jay English, with APCO. Credit goes to Jay and his work back in 15. He is on Working Group 4 with us. He actually started out as lead of our sub-team, and then the paying job loaded his plate up, so he handed that off to Mr. Lorello. But it's very important to recognize that in the TFOPA work, both with cyber and in the networks on 911, that report identifies the transitional phases that governmental entities use as they transition and get to a full end state. As we began to get into the weeds of looking at impacts that cybersecurity could have on these various transitional states, the team actually identified that we could consolidate some of those. So for the purposes of cybersecurity, our focus really is on legacy state, transitional, and end state in terms of focus and recommendations to mitigate risk. The report is also designed to address security considerations that's intended to look at the larger threat landscape and how industry and public safety can work together to combined as a solid force to focus on those threats, the analysis, and the approach to manage it. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Tim since he maintains the cybersecurity expertise, and this is the heavy lift of the report. So, Tim, it's yours now.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Yeah, the next part is going to talk about the analysis work we did as a result of putting sections 6 and 7 together for the report. As Mary just indicated, we had to look at a very broad range of capabilities because when you're starting with legacy and moving all the way to an all IP-based next generation technology that represents NG911, of course, it's a very broad range of technologies that are involved. And so what we started with was understanding what we called attack surfaces. How might our emergency communication centers be attacked from a cyber perspective? And we identified 7 major areas. The first one is rather interesting because it represents the caller. This is the first time, I mean, honestly, in today's legacy environment, we get voice calls. And so the idea of having a cybersecurity threat through a voice call is just not really there per se. But as you go into multimedia and actually providing other kinds of data information from an end user, that actually, interestingly enough, opens up the situation where the caller can actually become an attacker, can become an attack surface, if you will. And so we wanted to make sure we thought about the nuances and the specifics that involved what happens when you bring a next generation multimedia 911 call into our emergency communication centers. We also talked about the fact that we have interconnection between our centers and the outside world. In the cases of threats number 2, 3, and 7, we're specifically talking about the interconnections between the center and other centers, whether they be in EZNet, whether they be tied to other local governments, or whether they be even part of your EZNet, neighboring center. And so we wanted to make sure we understood that those were potential attack surfaces as well. We addressed the fact that we have to look at the future of what's going on, that during this transition, we're going to deal with a time factor here where new technologies are going to come into the center through Internet of Things technologies, if you will. And so we wanted to make sure we also addressed the future of threats that were going to come from that vector. And then finally, we did not want to leave out the fact that there's a human factor here with regards to cybersecurity practices and risks. And so 5 and 6 address the fact that you have staff and you have those IT folks who are very critical to maintaining your centers, but also have incredible access and authority that allow them, therefore, I mean, they tend to be where hackers really want to try to focus. If they can get into a center through an IT person, then they have sort of the keys to the kingdom. And so as we talk about analyzing the threats and how we might mitigate them, the first step was to look at cyber attack surfaces, and these 7 areas represent what we looked at and how we phrased our thought process around the threats themselves. Next slide, please. So as we go into Section 7 was then to focus on, well, if you have these attack surfaces, what kind of threat protection and mitigation strategies might we put into place that would address that? And of course, we're going to deal with a broad range of attacks, data breaches, and various cyber attacks. What kinds of things might we address and think about? And so we had to organize our thoughts. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Much like what the Task Force for Optimal PSAP Architecture did, the cybersecurity group in that group focused in on NIST, the cybersecurity framework from the National Institute of Science and Technology that has become the Bible, if you will, for cybersecurity practices out there in the marketplace today. And we thought following that same model might be helpful here in trying to organize our thoughts on how one might deal with threat protection and mitigation. So we look at the identify section where we look at actual types of threats. We look at protection, which would involve things like how, what kinds of technologies you might put in place to protect your centers. We look at detection methodologies and detection technologies. And again, we pulled very heavily from the TFOPA report, which talked about the Emergency Communications Cybersecurity Center and the idea of having a local or sort of a centralized place where information could be gathered, analyzed, and then spread across multiple agencies to help detect anomalies and then address them, which of course is in the response category, how one might then respond to those anomalies detected. And then finally, in the recovery strategy, not only we talk a little bit about incident response type techniques, but we've also focused on cyber insurance and the fact that having a cyber insurance program in place could be useful, and how one should address cyber insurance in particular, because we want the cyber insurance not to be the driver of the response, but the supporter of the kind of response you can give. And so those are the kinds of topics we focused in on in the document itself. Next slide, please. We wanted to make sure we didn't get completely theoretical. So we wanted to focus on specific use cases, and this was in the identify section of the report, where we focused in on 6 key use cases, and then talked a little bit about how one might mitigate those, remediate them, and that informed the rest of the document to some extent as well. So we looked at DOS, distributed denial of service attacks, and telephony denial of service attacks, both of which have a cyber aspect to them. And therefore, and are being seen quite actively in the marketplace today. And so we talked about those. We talked about swatting. The impact of cybersecurity on swatting is the fact that if you can change the integrity of the data being shared, for example, change the location of the caller, you can then possibly invoke a response that is not really appropriate to the actual concern or the emergencies concern that's out there and happening. So a swatting attack, of course, is an example of sending police, in this particular example, out to a place that really doesn't have an emergency response necessary, and then creating problems because of that. The middle one with the skull and crossbones is meant to remind us that there's always malware, and in particular ransomware attacks that are out there. They're pounding on our centers and our localities very hard right now. So we wanted to make sure we addressed those. The far right one talks about data privacy, the issue. We just recently heard about the Blue Leaks, where we had police officer information that was stolen from some repositories and then posted out in the website in various nefarious and malignant ways. And so data breach and making sure that we understand how to keep the privacy of the citizens' information, as well as the privacy of our emergency responders, our first responders, safe. That was an important element. And then finally, the insider threat, that human element, where we have to both deal with the type of insider who might intentionally be trying to harm us or steal information, as well as the accidental threat, the accidental insider attack, which typically is constituted in a phishing attack or something of that nature, where somebody inside is duped into doing something that supports a nefarious actor outside. So those were 6 really useful use cases we did document quite nicely, and then sort of talked about that the mitigation approaches that one can use that and those used for these, and so that informs some of the later aspects of the document. Next slide, please. We thought it was important, especially if we were looking at mitigation broadly, to take a big picture view of things. Now, the ICAM model is the identity, credentialing, and access management, ICAM. And basically, if you think about it, it's the big picture of how to make sure that the data that's being passed around remains confidential, that the integrity of the data is clear, and that the availability of the information and data is always, and our centers in particular are always there. And so ICAM was one of those models that we used as a way to describe sort of the bigger picture view, as well as we talked about public key infrastructure and some of the things that are used to help authenticate and make sure that we have a trusted system, a trusted network of systems talking to each other in very trusted ways. And so we looked at the protocols that were being discussed and some of the scenarios, and we used this ICAM as the big picture view of how to address mitigation strategies in general. Next slide. And so at this point, I think I'll just go ahead and pass it back to Mary. I'm here for you if you need me for anything on these next slides with regard to conclusions and recommendations. But this is the sort of the conclusion of sort of the wrap up of the report, if you will.
Thank you, Tim. Council, so we've actually, as I indicated earlier, Tim also alluded to, we went back, some foundational work was through TFOPA and Working Group 1. I don't know that Jay and those of us who worked with him during that initiative would have realized that that would have been the foundational document for building on cyber issues for 911 in our country. But we made a statement in that report that a lack of cybersecurity posed a clear and present danger to emergency communication systems in the United States. And that was very clear as it moved forward with the EC3 recommendation. So Working Group 4 for CSRIC 7 did conclude that managing 911 cybersecurity needed to include public and private partnerships, strong public-private partnerships, that cooperation is needed in all levels of public safety, both operationally and financially, because there are costs involved on both sides to minimize our risk there. Maintain environments that identify the threats that are possible on the emergency communications systems, recommend the importance on that and how to mitigate them. And then the final conclusion that we drew was that we needed to be in an environment where you could share intelligence reports, practices for defending those 911 networks, cooperative architectures as they're being built out that would defend risk on those networks as we transition until we actually get into a full in-state IP next-gen 911 environment. Next slide, please. We make several recommendations. Tim spoke to this. In the use cases, it actually has quite a bit of best practice and recommendations, but we also wanted to bring out some ones that had not been stated there. We feel that it's very important that we have the implementation of appropriate industry recognized cybersecurity controls throughout the entirety where it's possible, and in phases if necessary, if the entities can't do everything at one time. We would recommend that organizations at least implement a basic security control for their systems, regardless of the size of these legacy environments. And then from a next generation 911 network standpoint, implement foundational security controls and some of the organizational security controls as well that's discussed. And then finally, for this portion of recommendations, as a reminder to both public and private sector, implement best practices that are in Report 2, and we will continue to document and recommend best practices in Report 3. Next slide, please. And so our final set of recommendations is really, Madam Chair, to the FCC, to the Commission for future initiatives. It sounds like Farouk's work group has the same trend. We're just setting the course for more work, but take this report and Report 3, going forward, review and revise the report to accommodate the changes in cybersecurity advancements. So we continue to improve on the security recommendations for 911. And then there were aspects that we did not get into in this initiative that need to be considered for future reports from a cyber aspect. Look at the future technologies of over-the-top network solutions, text to 911, look at legacy TTY architectures that are in place throughout our public safety industry, set for the delivery of supplemental data and the use of handset applications and those vulnerabilities to cyber threats that needs to be explored. The Internet of Things, smart cities, 5G, and then as other cybersecurity topics become available that we don't know about today, but we're certain will evolve, also address those as they're known. Next slide. So, Madam Chair, this does conclude our report too. We're honored to set our country on a path forward to dealing with cyber and 911. I would recommend adoption of this report to the council, and thank y'all for your time.
Mary, thank you very much, and Tim, thank you very much. That was very informative. Let's open it up for questions. Any questions for Mary or Tim? Not hearing any questions. I'd like to take a vote on the recommendations in the report. So, may I have the ayes, please?
Aye.
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 Any nays? Thank you, Mary, and Working Group 4. The report is adopted. We're going to turn up. Thank you again, Mary. We're going to return to just Working Group updates, and then we'll discuss closing comments. So, with that, I'm going to move to Kathy Whitbeck and Working Group 2, Managing Security Risks and the Transition to 5G.
Okay, thank you. I want to start by adding my congratulations to Lee Thibodeau, Chair Emeritus of Working Group 2. The entire team thanks Lee for the opportunity to serve with him. Throughout his career, I've had the privilege of watching him foster cultures of excellence and contributing to the industry in so many ways that put customers' reliability and security first. He will be missed, and we wish him well. Next slide, please. As you can see, our team members bring a, next slide. As you can see, our team members bring a diverse background to our work. We appreciate everyone's time and inputs. This is our second report. It has some very meaty items to it, so we are working diligently. Next slide, please. We have an alternate to welcome here. Andrew Shanese from the Insight team has joined us, and we appreciate his inputs as well. And as you know, our alternates are absolutely integral to the team. Next slide, please. As a reminder, Working Group 2 is focused, I think of it as the path to 5G, and thank you, Farouk, for that lovely introduction and distinction in terms of the architectures that we're working with here. We are focused on the industry as we build upon existing 4G networks, so connecting 5G radios to 4G cores, for example. Next slide, please. Since we are adding elements to 4G networks, one of the things Working Group 2 is taking a close look at is the implications and any risks associated with those new elements. Does the risk profile change with the new element? As we build toward the 5G network, we want to make sure that new features don't degrade progress that has already been made in network security, or that we don't do something that inadvertently opens us up. So, lots of focus on the impact to existing networks as we add these elements. Next slide, please. The FCC has asked the working group to evaluate 3GPP SA3 standards. There are a number of security-related aspects of communications such as digital certificates, certificate authorities that are included in the release that the working group is evaluating to ensure that the introduction of the 5G new radio maintains our high expectations for security and reliability. The Commission has also asked Working Group 2 to identify optional features in 3GPP standards that could diminish the effectiveness of 4G security and to make recommendations to address the gaps. We've had a lively discussion on the background and intent behind 3GPP's mandatory to implement, optional to deploy requirement. We're finding that there are a number of reasons why an item may be optional, but that do not change the risk profile or introduce new vulnerabilities. In some cases, the feature may be relevant to a particular use case within a carrier's network, or may not be relevant to a particular use case, or there may be equal but different paths to meet the same security requirement. We've also found from a public policy perspective, it's important to remember that standards bodies operate at a global level. They need to accommodate regional and conflicting national and regional needs. So some nations and regions require the ability to individually determine if they will support a security capability, as well as the ability to turn it off. And in some cases, the technology used to fulfill a requirement may have legal restrictions. So for example, exporting encryption technologies. So as we're working through this, we're considering all of those factors. And as we work toward what are the things that are already table stakes for U.S. carriers and what are those things that could present a risk as we move toward 5G. Next slide, please. I do want to take a step back for a moment. I think Farouk did a nice job of laying the groundwork here to help understand where Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 meet. As we discussed in our first report, the NSA architecture leverages that existing 4G control plane, and as a result, risks associated with 4G may carry over. The security risks associated with 4G have been extensively studied. There's a great body of documentation put out there in CSRIC already. So we're looking to build upon that as 5G starts to touch the network. Next slide, please. The team is leveraging NIST guidance as we evaluate risk and potential impacts to the networks, looking at our remediation options and working toward recommendations. The team is taking what I think of as both a thematic and a very systematic approach to evaluating the optional features. Where appropriate, the team is reaffirming existing guidance from previous CSRICs to evaluate or to ensure they remain relevant, and reaching out to industry experts and researchers to ensure due diligence on optional requirements. Next slide. Working Group 2 submitted Report 1 to the Council at the June meeting. Thank you again for your consideration and approval. The team did a thorough review of recent research on emerging issues and made a series of recommendations related to best practices. The team is working diligently toward a December due date for Report 2. Next slide, please. Along with our regular working calls, the team continues to collaborate with Working Group 3. The team is also starting a conversation with Working Group 4, whom we just heard from, to make sure that we appropriately scope optional requirements that may impact public safety. So we extend our thanks to Mary Boyden team and Farouk and Working Group 3 as we work through this process and make sure that we cover the topic thoroughly. Next slide. So I want to say thank you again to the members of Working Group 2. We are having robust discussion. It's making a difference, and thank you to the Council. Any questions? We will have much more to talk about at the next Council meeting.
Thank you, Kathy, for your update. And I'm going to open it up for Danny McPherson, Working Group 6, to talk about security vulnerabilities and a status on their work group.
Yes, okay. Danny McPherson here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Danny, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. I'll be fairly brief here in this. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is Working Group 6. We provided information on the background before assessing SIP security vulnerabilities. SIP's an application layer protocol that's used for signaling and setting up a lot of stuff to include emergency services and 911 capabilities. And our job was to assess whether whether vulnerabilities existed, if best current practices existed around those vulnerabilities, the implications of those on emergency services and so forth. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So the working group objectives are outlined here. I've reported on this multiple times to the council. As you can see, there are 3 or 4 primary tasks here that we begin work on. We're well along the way. Let's move on to the next slide. Just going to move right through these for you. So here you can see what we've done thus far and what's left for us to do. Our final reports are due in the spring or early next year. We believe we're on track for that reasonably. We've made good progress. We've had subject matter briefings. We've identified task leaders. We've got some early drafts together. We just need to start formatting things and getting it put together and putting a little bit more meat on the bone. And then also make sure that we're all aligned in our thinking and that everyone gets a proper chance to voice any additional items we may want to include in our reports. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Again, just another timeline, the timeline associated with the deliverables for the working group that you're looking at. Let's go on one more slide here. Oh, no, this is the members and the alternates in the next slide. You can move through these fairly quickly. And then next steps, one of the things we're doing, of course, because there's such a great body of knowledge in GSMA related to this, 3GPP and the IETF and other organizations, we want to make sure that we properly catalog the broad corpus of work that's underway related to this, and don't duplicate work, and our job isn't necessarily to harmonize any efforts in that, but to identify gaps. So make sure we identify gaps that may be falling through the cracks across the organizations. And then what the FCC or the members of the working group and so forth may do to help address these gaps. So that's currently where we're at. We've had some good progress, quite frankly. A little slow over the summer with a bit of the COVID drag and whatnot, but I'm confident after dialogue with the working group members and splitting things up into teams and drafting teams and whatnot that we'll be on track to deliver a quality work product to the council for consideration on these topics and to better this challenging area as it continues to evolve. So with that, I think the slides are fairly self-explanatory. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take those. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Madam Chairman.
Any questions for Danny?
This is Tim Lorello. I have one question.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Danny, one of the things, we've been doing a lot of assessments of centers, of emergency communication centers around the country, and one thing that I've been seeing is the scanning techniques that are being used by outside players on SIP that seem to be able to reach all the way inside to enumerate, actual termination points within the architecture. Do you think you all will be able to look at mitigation techniques for some of that? Because obviously they aren't happening right now.
Yeah, so the way that we divided this out was in various things, which things are in the protocols, which things are internal to the specific implementations, which things are deployment models, which things are external but systemic dependencies. And I suspect, based on what I heard you just say, and I am aware of some of these, I heard these in briefings and generally aware, that it actually fits into a couple of those items. So in short, I will ensure that that our final report or our draft reports and our final work products contemplate what you just said. And maybe even bounce it off of you, or if you want to provide some more information to the working group, we would certainly welcome that in the form of an email or a SME briefing. So I'll follow up with you offline on that, Tim. Thank you for bringing it to our attention.
No, thank you.
Any other questions for Danny? Okay. Well, coming to the close, and first of all, on behalf of the council, I also want to thank Lee Thibodeau for his commitments to this CSRIC and others in the past, as well as all of the things that he's done to make the world a safer place. And Lee, I'm going to give you the floor to make a couple of comments if you'd like.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just by way of a sound check, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Lee.
All right. I will be brief. first off, I want to recognize a couple of people that have provided a lot of support and guidance and advice to me. First, the representatives from the FCC, Suzanne, when I was appointed to lead Working Group 2 last summer, I went to Suzanne immediately and said, I can't do this. I'm not qualified to do it. And she said, well, that's too bad you're going to do it. And I appreciate her pushing me to do it and supporting me along the way.
That is not what I said.
Suzanne, I was paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. But I do appreciate.
That's not what happened.
I appreciate your support and guidance. And second, also, Curry and Jacob was is the liaison to Working Group 2, and Curry was always available to answer questions and provide supports, and I appreciate his work there. Second, to the CSRIC council members themselves, Madam Chair, I know I called you a number of times for guidance and with a number of questions, and you were always available and helped me a great deal in that respect. As well, my colleagues who many became friends on Working Groups 2 and 3 were always very much engaged in the effort, very supportive. We had very lively discussion and debate, but everyone contributed, and I learned an immense amount from this group of people, and that's very much appreciated. In particular, I wanted to single out Farouk Khatibi, the chair of Working Group 3. Farouk and I spent many hours on the phone trying to figure out how we were going to draw that hard line between Working Group 2 and Working Group 3. And I drew a lot on his expertise and guidance on that, because in some of those areas, I truly had no idea what I was doing. And Farouk helped a great deal and became a good friend. And I do appreciate that, Farouk. Thank you very much. As well, Kathy Whitbeck and I have worked together for, I think, almost 10 years now. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for Kathy. She's a capable leader. She's represented Insight on a number of state, federal, and industry forums, and brings a great deal of knowledge, expertise, leadership to Working Group 2. So I think you'll find that Working Group 2 is in very good hands there. So again, to thank you to everyone. I've spent about almost 5 years involved in CSRIC, have learned a great deal. I'm honored to have served it, and hopefully I've added to the body of knowledge and leadership there. In closing, I have spent a little over 41 years in the telecommunications industry, seen an immense amount of change, as many of you have. Just thinking back, when I started, there was still a noticeable amount of rotary dial in the network, and I recently had to explain to one of Insight's youngest engineers what rotary dial was, so I assumed it was time for me to get out. But it has been the most interesting, the most challenging, the most rewarding industry that I could have imagined to have worked in for that period of time. Enjoyed it immensely, but it's time to move on, and Farouk, rest assured, I will be dedicating full time to lowering my handicap and to teaching my grandchildren all the silly things that they're going to need to know as they grow. So again, thank you all very much. Your guidance and support has been much appreciated, and I wish the CSRIC team well. Thank you. And back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Lee. On behalf of the entire council, I know that we're excited for you, but we'll also miss you and your contributions. So good luck in your future, and I'm sure our paths will cross somewhere, somehow. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne for any last moment comments that she has prior to closing the meeting.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. I would first like to say thank you to all the members of Working Groups 1, 3, and 4 who delivered reports today. The reports are incredibly well done, with a great deal of effort, I know, behind each of them. And I remind people at the FCC all the time how much work you all do on a voluntary basis for CSRIC that is really for the FCC, and it makes a difference in what we do. And I hope you all know that we really do appreciate all the effort and the expertise and the knowledge that you all contribute constantly to this effort. I also deeply appreciate the progress reports from Kathy Whitbeck, our new chair of Working Group 2, and from Danny McPherson. And I'm excited. I finally get the chance to thank Lee. I've waited to the end. I think, Lee, you are one of the most exceptional gentlemen I've had the pleasure of working with in years. You are such a knowledgeable and yet kind and gracious person at all times. You were a member of 5, 6, and 7, which is the same length of time that I've been either the deputy or CFO of CSRIC. So I've had the pleasure of working with you in under each charter. You have contributed a huge amount of your time and expertise helping the FCC consider the best approach to these various issues. And I know you're going to greatly enjoy your retirement and spending time with your grandchildren. And please know that you will be very missed, and that I will never forget how great it has been working for you. And on behalf of the entire commission, I thank you. So with that, I am going to adjourn the 6th meeting of CSRIC. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, members of CSRIC. We appreciate all you do, and have a great day.
You too. Take care.